Welcome back to another deep dive. We are really thrilled to have you here with us today.
Absolutely. Glad to be back.
And before we jump into the material, do us a massive favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the show right now.
It really helps us out.
It does. It ensures you never miss one of these deep dives. So today's subject is an ebook that has been making, well, serious waves recently.
To put it mildly.
Right. It's a text that aims to fundamentally rewire how you understand the history of our institutions, especially before they were, as the author argues, captured by feminists and Marxists.
Yeah. If you are interested in the roots of modern systemic issues, this is going to be right up your alley.
Definitely. And if you find yourself hooked by the end of our discussion and you want to dig into the source material yourself, you can check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to purchase it.
You can also follow the author directly. His handle is @ConradNRiker on Substack.
So, the mission of this deep dive today is to provide a comprehensive analysis of this highly controversial 2026 ebook. It's titled Feminism's Trojan Horse: How Female Power Destroys from Within by Conrad Riker.
A very provocative title.
Very. We are going to meticulously map out the author's philosophical framework, his specific historical claims, and his proposed solutions for the modern man.
But before we get into the weeds here, I need to make a very crucial clarification for you, the listener.
Yeah, this is important.
The source material we're examining today is highly politically charged. I mean, it dives headfirst into intense debates about gender, society, and how our modern institutions, from courts to corporations, were built and potentially captured.
Right.
So we want to explicitly state that we are not taking sides here. We are not endorsing, nor are we condemning the viewpoints presented in this book.
Exactly. Our goal today is just to act as your impartial guides. We are objectively reporting on the ideas and the arguments contained within the original text so you can fully understand the author's perspective.
We're just here to look at the architecture of the argument.
And the hook of Riker's premise is guaranteed to grab your attention. His core thesis is that modern feminism is not and never was an equality movement.
Right, he argues it's something entirely different.
He argues that it is a parasitic extraction mechanism, and he claims its roots stretch from the original sin in the Garden of Eden, straight through history, right into the modern corporate HR department.
It is a massive historical and ideological timeline he constructs. He doesn't just look at the last 10 years or so.
No, he attempts to rewrite the entire historical narrative of gender relations. Okay, let's unpack this, because he literally starts in the Garden of Eden.
He does.
Riker details what he calls the Edenic pattern. He frames the story of Eve not just as a theological event, but as the very first transaction in human history.
According to the text, Eve traded the eternal safety and provision provided by Adam for a vow of hidden knowledge and power from a serpent. And he uses that ancient story as the foundational blueprint for his entire theory. He argues that this Edenic pattern is the eternal temptation to prioritize subversive power over stable protection.
It's a heavy framing.
It is. And what's fascinating here is how he draws a direct historical line from that original transaction to the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention.
Which most of us are taught was the glorious birth of the women's rights movement.
Right, the convention where the Declaration of Sentiments was signed. We are usually taught that was the moment women stood up against tyranny.
So how does Riker frame it differently for the reader?
He argues that the Declaration of Sentiments actually manufactured a grievance by deliberately misrepresenting the past. He focuses heavily on the legal concept of coverture, which was the law of the land back then.
Coverture meaning the legal status of a married woman?
Exactly. It essentially meant that a woman's legal rights and obligations were subsumed by those of her husband. Modern history views this as pure oppression. Riker, however, points out that under coverture, husbands were legally liable for their wives' actions and debts. A man could literally be thrown into debtor's prison if he couldn't maintain his wife's standard of living.
So he's saying it was a system of absolute male liability, not just male authority.
Exactly his point. Riker claims the women at Seneca Falls demanded to dismantle that system. They wanted the privileges and autonomy of full citizenship, but without
assuming the responsibility.
Right, without the corresponding life or death responsibilities that men held, like the military draft or the crushing burden of absolute financial liability. He views it as a demand for power without consequence.
That is a total inversion of the standard historical narrative. And from there, he traces the ideological lineage forward.
Yeah, he points out that the actual word feminism wasn't coined by a woman.
Right, it was coined by a utopian socialist named Charles Fourier in 1837.
And he follows this ideology through Friedrich Engels' 1884 work on the family, right up to the critical theory of the Frankfurt School.
Let's unpack the Frankfurt School connection, because that term gets thrown around a lot, but Riker uses it very specifically here.
The Frankfurt School popularized critical theory in the mid-20th century. Traditional Marxism viewed the world strictly through the lens of class struggle, the wealthy factory owners oppressing the working class.
Right.
Riker argues that the Frankfurt School took that exact framework of the oppressor versus the oppressed and mapped it directly onto men and women.
He actually uses the phrase Marxism with estrogen to describe modern intersectionality.
He does. The text argues that the true underlying goal of this ideology has never been equality in the workplace or the voting booth.
According to Riker, the objective is to destroy the Western nuclear family unit.
His logic is that if you can atomize the citizen and break down the traditional kin group, you can transfer all of that loyalty, dependency, and authority over to a centralized state bureaucracy.
So by reframing the family home as a site of oppression, the ideology justifies transferring the role of the provider from the husband to the government.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If that is his historical framework, that the goal is transferring reliance to the state, how does he see that playing out in our actual day-to-day lives today?
This is where he takes aim at modern institutions.
Right, starting with the legal system. He outlines a theory that the state has quite literally become a substitute husband.
The core insight here is that Riker views the state not as an impartial referee in domestic disputes, but as a financially motivated participant.
He claims that family courts act as wealth transfer mechanisms.
They fracture the family, and in doing so, they extract resources from men to give to women while taking a cut for the state apparatus.
He brings in some very specific fiscal data to back this up too. He points out that men pay approximately 75% of all federal income taxes,
while women, as a demographic aggregate, represent a net negative tax contribution over their lifetime.
He uses that economic disparity as a massive pillar of his thesis.
He frames that data as empirical proof of an extraction mechanism. In his view, men are funding a civilization that is simultaneously being weaponized against them.
He claims the government acts as the collection agency, and the family courts serve as the ruthless enforcement mechanism for this ongoing transfer of resources.
And then he takes that same analytical lens to the modern workplace, specifically DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives.
He describes the modern corporate environment using an incredibly provocative term. He calls it Menkampf.
It is extremely aggressive rhetoric. He uses that term to suggest there is a systematic attribution of collective guilt applied to men as a class within corporate structures.
He outlines what he calls a triple bind for male workers today. Walk me through how he thinks HR departments are trapping men.
Riker argues that men in captured corporate environments face three impossible choices. If a man is highly competent and speaks up about inefficiencies or systemic problems,
he's quickly labeled toxic or difficult and pushed out.
Right. Now, if he's incompetent and stays quiet, he's rightfully fired for poor performance.
Makes sense.
But if he is competent and remains completely silent, his competence is exploited. His labor is used to prop up a system that, according to the author, inherently resents his presence.
He points to the famous James Damore Google memo as a prime example of this.
Yeah, Damore wrote an internal memo discussing biological differences in tech interests, citing peer-reviewed psychology.
And he was fired shortly after. But Riker doesn't frame that firing as a simple HR policy disagreement, does he?
No, he frames Damore's firing as a religious purge of a heretic.
Wow.
Riker argues that feminized institutions, like modern corporate HR, operate on emotional consensus and conformity rather than objective logical analysis.
Therefore, when someone like Damore presents objective data that contradicts the emotional consensus of the group, it isn't treated as a scientific debate.
It's treated as an act of violence.
So if HR departments are enforcing this specific corporate culture, it begs the question, where did they learn to operate this way?
Riker points the finger directly at the university system that trained them.
The text paints a picture of educational institutions that have entirely abandoned the pursuit of objective truth in favor of manufacturing grievances.
Riker draws a very specific trajectory here. He starts with Title IX, arguing that it originally demanded basic educational access, but was slowly mutated into demand for strictly equal outcomes, regardless of merit or interest.
Then he jumps to the Obama administration's 2011 Dear Colleague letter.
That letter mandated universities use the preponderance of evidence standard in campus sexual assault cases.
Right, and for you listening who might not know the legal terminology, preponderance of evidence basically means just a 51% likelihood of guilt.
It's the lowest possible burden of proof.
A monumental shift. Riker argues this effectively eliminated due process for accused men on campus.
But the true cultural tipping point, according to the text, was the 2015 Columbia University Mattress Girl protest by Emma Sulkowicz.
Let's translate his academic language here. He says this protest created a new epistemological framework. What does that actually mean for a student on campus?
Well, epistemology is the study of how we know what is true. Riker argues that the Mattress Girl protest fundamentally changed how universities process truth.
In his view, it created a new system where the mere act of accusation is treated as a conviction.
The foundational Western concept of innocent until proven guilty was thrown out the window. In this new framework, he argues, men are presumed guilty by default.
And if a man is actually exonerated through due process, the activists don't see it as justice.
They just see it as further proof that the system is corrupt. He calls this the institutionalization of hysteria.
If academia changes how we evaluate truth itself, how does that bleed into the broader culture?
If we connect this to the bigger picture.
This brings us to his concept of the media matrix.
Right. Riker argues that the modern media apparatus does not exist to entertain or inform you. He claims it exists to act as a maternal comfort blanket.
He compares Hollywood's modern diversity and representation efforts to Soviet Lysenkoism.
Lysenkoism.
That was the Soviet agricultural policy under Stalin, right? Where they completely denied basic genetics because the science didn't fit Marxist political ideology.
Exactly. Millions of people starved to death because the Soviets forced biological reality to submit to political doctrine. Riker argues Hollywood is doing the exact same thing to culture today.
He claims they are denying biological reality and sexual dimorphism to fit feminist ideology.
He points to specific modern films like the recent Barbie movie and the live-action Little Mermaid.
He doesn't even view these as artistic choices. He calls them compliance documents.
He views them as propaganda designed to simulate equal outcomes on a screen without requiring equal effort in reality. He calls this the heroine with 1,000 faces fallacy.
The traditional hero's journey requires a man to suffer, fail, rebuild himself, and overcome.
Right. But Riker argues the modern heroine's journey in media usually just involves a woman realizing she was inherently flawless and powerful all along.
And the only obstacle was the patriarchy holding her back.
He argues that the culture industry is deliberately placing women center stage on platforms that were built and are currently maintained entirely by invisible male labor.
It's a hallucination sold to the public. But Riker makes a highly controversial pivot here. He pushes his theory past economics and media straight into theology.
It is a profound shift in his argument.
He links the roots of modern feminism to the occult, specifically the esoteric Luciferianism of figures like Madame Blavatsky in the 19th century.
He claims that the modern divine feminine or sacred feminine movement isn't a true spiritual path, but a dangerous regression to pre-civilized paganism.
So how does he connect that to the daily lives of men?
He argues that the traditional masculine conception of God in the West brought us objective truth, individual rights, and universal blind law.
In contrast, he claims this new Mother Nature theology brings a return to emotional reasoning, subjective truth, and tribalism.
He posits that the spiritual rebellion against the father archetype is the actual theological engine driving the biased family courts and the HR departments we discussed earlier.
It is a total rejection of objective masculine boundaries. And he applies this exact same theological argument to the modern gender debate.
We want to impartially report his stance here, as it is a foundational pillar of his thesis.
Riker asserts that the exponential rise in transgenderism is a direct, inescapable consequence of feminist ideology, relentlessly deconstructing biological reality.
He structures it as a logical syllogism. First, he claims feminism argued for decades that gender is merely a social construct, arbitrarily imposed on biological sex by men.
Then he says transgenderism comes along and claims that gender identity is innate, spiritual, and completely overrides biological reality.
He points out that these two ideas are inherently contradictory, yet they stem from the exact same desire.
The desire to transcend, manipulate, or escape the physical boundaries of the body.
He makes an incredibly intense historical comparison here. The text compares modern gender transition to the ancient cults of Cybele and Attis in Rome and Phrygia.
In those cults, priests would literally castrate themselves as an entry fee to serve the goddess in sacred feminine spaces.
Riker frames modern medical transition for young men through that exact historical lens. He does not view it as genuine healthcare.
He views it as surgical mutilation and chemical castration driven by a therapy state.
An ideology that fundamentally hates masculinity and seeks to physically erase it. Furthermore, he argues the medical-industrial complex is entirely complicit.
Because they have discovered the perfect business model,
Right.
creating permanent, lifelong patients out of physically healthy bodies.
We've covered the history, the institutions, the media, and the theology.
So what does this all mean? How does Riker see this playing out right now in the day-to-day lives of the men reading this book? Let's talk about the modern symptoms he identifies, starting with the sexual marketplace.
Riker views the modern dating scene as a complete disaster of unchecked digital hypergamy.
Hypergamy being the tendency to mate upwards in social or economic status.
Right, and he argues that apps like Tinder and what he calls the Instagram to OnlyFans pipeline have weaponized this instinct.
In his view, this technology has created a system where a tiny fraction of top-tier men get all the attention.
While a massive percentage of average men possess zero romantic or reproductive stake in civilization.
Meanwhile, an entire generation of young women is being taught that empowerment simply means monetizing male loneliness through screens.
He makes a really surprising connection here between this feminine nurturing impulse and national immigration policy.
He calls it pathological altruism. He argues that a civilization refusing to defend its borders is suffering from a spiritual surrender.
In his framework, the feminine instinct to nurture and provide unconditional acceptance is beautiful and necessary, but only within the protected boundaries of the family unit.
When you apply that maternal instinct to national borders, offering unconditional acceptance to the world without the masculine check of boundary enforcement, discernment, and resource limitation, it ceases to be compassion.
It becomes a weapon of civilizational suicide.
If we take a step back and look at his whole board, if he believes every institution, from the Border Patrol to the HR department to the university to the family court, is completely captured by this ideology, what is a man supposed to do? What is Riker's ultimate solution?
This raises an important question, and his solution is absolute and uncompromising. He tells his readers to go Galt.
That's a direct reference to Ayn Rand's novel Atlas Shrugged, where John Galt leads the productive, logical members of society to simply go on strike and withdraw their labor from a corrupt system.
Exactly. Riker explicitly tells his readers not to attempt to reform captured institutions. He says you cannot fix the asylum from within.
Trying to reform a system that was specifically designed to extract your labor while demonizing your existence is, in his words, suicide disguised as virtue.
Instead, he advocates for building a parallel polis, or the New Jerusalem. He wants men to construct entirely new parallel institutions that are structurally immune to feminist capture.
He gives very tactical implementation steps for this. He calls them the stones of this new civilization. Walk us through them.
The first stone is economic independence. He advocates for using Bitcoin and cryptocurrency to completely bypass central banking and fiat currency.
Protecting your assets from what he views as an extractive feminist state.
The second stone is career independence. He urges men to utilize the gig economy, freelancing, and specialized consulting to bypass corporate HR commissars and DEI mandates entirely.
And the third stone is information independence, utilizing alternative media platforms like Rumble, Substack, and X to completely circumvent narrative control and censorship.
It's a strategy of starving the beast. If the system requires male labor, male tax revenue, and male infrastructure to survive, which he argues it absolutely does, then the ultimate weapon isn't protesting.
It's the quiet withdrawal of those things. The host walks away, and the parasite starves.
To conclude his framework, he calls for a cultural and spiritual return to what he calls the three sacred masculine archetypes. He says these have been systematically pathologized by modern society and desperately need to be restored.
First, there's the builder, the man who transforms raw matter into infrastructure through logic and effort.
Second, there's the protector, the man who willingly absorbs risk and danger so that society can flourish behind his shield.
And finally, the logician, the man who subjects his own emotions to reason and objective truth.
Riker argues that removing these three archetypes from our culture removes the very possibility of civilization itself.
It is a massive, sweeping thesis that reinterprets virtually every aspect of modern society through this specific lens of gynocentric capture and masculine withdrawal, which leaves us with a profound final thought to mull over.
Right. If we take Riker's proposed solution to its logical conclusion, if this parallel polis is actually achieved, if the builders, the protectors, and the logicians listen to this book and completely withdraw their labor, their taxes, and their participation from mainstream institutions to create a separate digital and economic monastery, what happens to the shared reality of a nation?
It's a huge unknown.
Can two entirely parallel civilizations, one operating on this new decentralized masculine framework, and the other remaining in the legacy institutions, truly coexist in the exact same physical space? Or does the complete separation of the productive class inevitably lead to a sudden and total collapse of the original societal structure?
It is a question that challenges the very foundation of how a country holds together. And it's a heavy question to leave you with. But exploring those deep architectures of thought is exactly what we do here.
Absolutely.
We hope this deep dive gave you a thorough understanding of the arguments laid out in the text and helped you see the history of these institutions through the author's eyes. Before you go, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe to the show so you never miss a deep dive like this.
And as we mentioned at the top, if you want to explore the source material and examine these arguments for yourself, you can check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook.
And you can follow the author at Conrad and Riker on Substack. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, and we will see you next time.